Hey everyone, congratulations! You are one of the very few amazing people who watch this channel, and I thank you for it. My name is Yuri Rashkin. This is Rashkin Report Perspectives. Hit like and subscribe and make sure to follow me on Substack. Thank you. When I sat down to talk with Vladimir Cherkas and his daughter Marina a few days ago, I already knew, on some level, what kind of conversation this was going to be. Not because I knew the details, I didn't, but because I recognized the shape of it. I recognized the pauses, the moments where language slows down not for drama, but because the speaker is choosing which memories can be safely brought into the light. I recognize the way time collapses, years turning into a single sentence, while a single door opening becomes something that lives in the body forever. I didn't learn that recognition from books or documentaries. I learned it from my family. My grandfather was arrested under Stalin as an enemy of the people. That phrase sounds maybe quaint now, like something from a museum exhibit or a history textbook, but it wasn't a legal term in the way we understand law. It wasn't a charge that needed to be proven. It was a designation, a sorting mechanism. Once you were placed inside it, the system no longer owed you a logic, explanation, or outcome. He survived the camps. Very few did. And when he came back to Moscow, he wasn't allowed to talk about what happened. Not to neighbors, not to colleagues, not to even fully to his own family. Silence wasn't a side effect of repression. It was part of the sentence. And yet, people came to see him. They didn't ask questions. They didn't stay long. They would come into the apartment quietly, look at him, and leave. Because in a world where millions disappeared, the mere fact that someone returned alive mattered. Presence itself became a form of testimony. Hope had no words, so it borrowed a body. There is the same logic that runs through everything Vladimir Cherkas describes. Even though the geography has changed, the uniforms are newer, and the rhetoric is dressed up in modern language. The system hasn't evolved. It has merely updated its interfaces. In the first part of our conversation, Vladimir describes how he was detained at a checkpoint while trying to move from occupied territory to Ukraine-controlled territory. There is no dramatic arrest, no shouting, no warrant, just documents taken away, a suggestion to step into another room, and then the familiar sequence begins. A bag over the head, hands taped, cuffs, transport, disorientation, violence. This is not interrogation. That distinction matters. Interrogation implies a goal, information, confession, leverage. What Vladimir describes is something else entirely. It is processing. The body is being taught a lesson before the mind is even invited into the conversation. And often the mind isn't never invited at all. He is beaten during transport. Mock executions are staged. Guns are fired into the ground around him. Not because anyone expects him to talk, but because the system needs him to understand that life and death are now arbitrary, that survival is no longer tied to behavior, truth, or compliance. It is tied to permission. When he is brought into a basement, tied to a chair, electrocuted, suffocated with water, and beaten again, there are still no real questions. Accusations are made, spy, foreign intelligence, but they're performative. Labels without content, exactly like enemy of the people. This is the first continuity point. Totalitarian systems do not begin with facts. They begin with categories. Once the category is assigned, facts become irrelevant. Guilt is no longer something to be established. It is something to be inhabited. That's why Vladimir says something that should stop every listener cold. They asked questions without waiting for answers. They didn't explain anything. They didn't argue. They simply acted. Later, when he is returned to his own apartment and used as bait, phone monitored, movements controlled, a human lure to see who might still trust him, the cruelty becomes quieter but no less precise. Even his own home is no longer his. It is now part of the infrastructure of repression. And then comes one of the most revealing moments in the entire story. He is forced to walk through the city wearing what he believes to be an explosive vest, with someone else holding the remote. This isn't about killing him. If they wanted him dead, he would already be dead. This is about demonstrating absolute ownership over his body in public space, turning him into a walking hostage to himself. This is not random cruelty, it is instructional cruelty. It teaches everyone involved, the guards, the passersby, the victim, what power looks like. Eventually, Vladimir is taken to изоляция. For those who don't know, изоляция is not a prison in the conventional sense. It is a former industrial space turned into a black site detention and torture facility in occupied Donetsk. It does not appear in official registries, and there are no visiting hours, no prosecutors, no oversight. It exists in a legal vacuum by design. That detail matters deeply. My grandfather was sent to camps that officially actually existed. They had names, numbers, bureaucracies, but even then, the reality inside them was deliberately obscured. Изоляция is simply a more honest version of the same idea, a place that exists precisely so the state can later say, we have no record of this person. When Vladimir is moved from изоляции to Makievskaya SIZO, the conditions change, but the logic does not. There are cameras everywhere. Doors opening means everyone must drop to their knees, face down, hands behind their heads. People are taken out for interrogation and dragged back half dead. Vladimir is spared the worst of the repeated basement torture, not because he is innocent, but because the system no longer needs anything from him. He has already been classified. That is the second continuity point. In Stalin's time, once a person was classified, their fate unfolded sometimes slowly, sometimes fast, but bureaucratically and often invisibly. Files moved, decisions were rubber-stamped, years sometimes passed. The cruelty was not always loud, it was procedural. Vladimir spent 6 years inside this system. 6 years as an important number, because it is long enough for the outside world to move on. Long enough for family members to exhaust official channels. Long enough for hope to become dangerous. Marina describes those years from the outside, the phone calls that go unanswered, the false medical explanation from a woman claiming to be a nurse, the realization that going to that hospital would have gotten family members arrested as well. This is another feature of the system. It expands outward. It does not punish individuals alone. It punishes connections. My grandmother understood this instinctively. As an attorney, she fought to keep my grandfather's file alive, not to challenge it openly, but to prevent it from disappearing. That distinction saved his life. In a system where silence kills, paperwork becomes resistance. Marina and her family do the same thing without the benefit of living in a functioning legal system. They search, they ask, they document, they wait, and they learn, slowly and painfully, that visibility is a double-edged sword. Publicity can help, but it does not create safety. It does not create control, and it never creates guarantees. That's because the system Vladimir is trapped in does not operate on justice. It operates on signals. When he is finally released, after serving a full 6-year sentence on fabricated charges, the moment feels deliberately staged to confuse both the victim and the observers. He signs papers, he is let out, and immediately the bag goes back over his head, new charges are produced, new accusations, administrative nonsense, weapons possession, disorderly conduct, anything that allows the system to reassert ownership. This is the third continuity point. Under Stalin, people were sometimes released briefly only to be rearrested, not because new evidence emerged, but because the release itself created uncertainty. It taught everyone watching that even survival is provisional. Vladimir is shuffled again, detention centers, temporary isolators, and then he's transported to Russia proper, Taganrog, and later to Urals. At that point, the fiction becomes complete. The same man who was once accused of spying for a foreign state is now simply inventory, a body to be moved, housed, beaten, sorted. In the Urals, he describes arrival procedures that are indistinguishable from war crimes. Mass beatings, prisoners forced to kneel while guards use batons for nearly an hour, special brutality reserved for Azov prisoners, disease-ridden cells, deliberate degradation. And still, no questions. That is the part that people raised in democracy struggle to understand. They keep asking, what did he do? Or why didn't they just let him go? Or what was the point? The point is the system itself. Totalitarian power is not transactional. It does not operate on exchange. It does not say, if you give me X, I will give you Y. It says you exist because I allow it, and I can withdraw that allowance at any moment. My grandfather lived under that logic. Vladimir Cherkass lived under that logic. Millions of others did and do. When Vladimir finally crosses back into Ukraine and sees the flag behind him, he describes a moment that is almost anticlimactic. No euphoria, no collapse, just confirmation. Because until confirmation, relief is dangerous. Hope is dangerous. The body learns not to celebrate until escape is complete. That too is inherited knowledge. I grew up in a culture where stories were told sideways, through fables, through jokes, through silences, where you learned which topics were safe not because someone told you, but because you watched who stopped talking when certain names were mentioned. The Soviet system trained people not to trust language. The Russian system continues that training today. That's why these conversations matter. Not because they're shocking. Cruelty is not new, but because they are clarifying. They show us that what we are dealing with is not a deviation, not a bad period, and not misunderstanding. It is a continuous operating system built on fear, categorization, and silence. Stalin perfected it, the KGB refined it, the modern Russian state rebranded it, but the logic remains intact. And that logic does not collapse on its own. It survives exposure, it survives outrage, it survives sanctions. What it cannot survive is memory that refuses to disappear. That is why my grandfather mattered when he returned. That is why Vladimir Cherkass matters now. Not because he is unique, but because he is visible, because he speaks, because he names the process without mythologizing it. This is not about heroism. It is about continuity. And once you see that continuity, once you understand that the same mechanisms are being used again with new victims in new locations, you can no longer pretend that this is about politics alone. It is about human inventory, about systems that treat identity as a crime and survival as a concession. That is what these two conversations show. And that is why they're not finished yet. Thanks for watching, everyone. Again, hit like and subscribe, and if you haven't yet, and please write in comments your thoughts and feelings about the story of Vladimir Cherkass, a man who chose his identity and paid a price. Remember to watch the full interview on this channel as well. Thank you, and see you again soon. You're watching Rashkin Report Perspectives. My name is Yuri Rashkin.